want to welcome you today to a talk about Mhór Street, Tullamore, as part of our presentation for Heritage Week 2024. And also I want to acknowledge in particular the support of the Heritage Council in the making of this production and the research for it. First of all, to give you a quick view of the location of Tullamore, and from this 1-inch map of about 1900, which shows the town, or most of the town, the canal and the river to the south of the canal, and then the great Charleville estate with the new road, which is coming there from the Red Gate to the Roman Catholic Chapel via Ballard. So you can see the planning that went into the extension of the estate in the 1800s, and similar planning went into the making of Tullamore town. Our first map, we do need to look at some maps, of course, to get our bearings. Our first map is from the Taylor and Skinner Book of Road Maps of 1777-83. There were two editions, and you can see Tullamore there, the outline of the streets of the town in heavy bold, and there's a windmill shown there. It's actually to the south of the main street, but in fact it was closer to Mhór Street, and hence I have it in this location. And then the road to Killeigh, and also the road to Charleville to the north. Tullamore then in Larkin's map, this is a pre-ordnance survey map of 2009, will show us again on the southern side of the town the commencement of Mhór Street and of Cormac Street, with Acres Hall shown there as a black blob looking in towards Mhór Street. Now, these maps are not to be taken as accurate in every respect, because there were other properties in Mhór Street that were built at that stage and are not shown on that map. For example, here we are now at the 1838 map, and this is on the 6-inch scale, and you can see here now Charleville Square, or O'Connor Square nowadays, in the centre of the town. And we move up then to High Street, and to the right is Earl Street, and that's Mhór Street today. Earl Street had three names in its time, or Mhór Street. First of all, it was Windmill Street, because of the windmills to the south of the street there. You can see windmills marked in ruins. Those windmills go back to about the 1720s, and in the street then was renamed probably around 1830 as Earl Street, after the Earls of Charleville. And then in 1905 the local council, at the behest of the Gaelic League, renamed all the streets of the town with the names of saints or of battles that we won, and hence Mhór Street, which in this case relates to the fact that it's on the road to Killeigh and on to Port Leash and Port Ardington, where the O'Moores of Leash dominated and were well remembered in local history and school histories as having put up a strong fight against the colonists in the 16th century. So these maps are very important, as the Ordnance Survey gives us the first really good base map for studying the streets of Tullamore, and we can see clearly there the outline of Earl Street / Mhór Street, with the extensive gardens to the back in regard to the north side of the town, and to a lesser extent on the southern side of Mhór Street. So we look a bit more closely now, and you can see there at the letters or figures 228 the beginning of Earl Street and the number of houses on it on the northern side, and also on the southern side. Probably about 16 on the southern side in 1838, and about 24, I think it was, on the northern side. What is particularly interesting there is that there was a garden that extended from High Street right into Mhór Street. You can follow that on the eastern side of the map in the location where Tullamore is today. You can see that garden. In fact, there's a wall in front of Tullamore that's a sort of a curved wall, and that reflects this old lease of two sites, one to High Street and one in Mhór Street back in the 1750s. We'll see that lease again in a moment. Just another view of the street on the 1912 ordnance map, and I'll be mentioning Victoria Terrace. That was a terrace of 7 houses built at the time that Victoria came to the throne in the late 1830s. And you can also see the manse. That's number 29 High Street, which I refer to from time to time. The reason I refer to it is because of the extensive garden behind the manse, which ran from the restaurant called Geashill. The boundary of the back of Geashill runs right along Mhór Street as a garden behind the houses, and that would reflect title of properties at the time. So who was giving out these leases? Well, the Earls of Charleville owned Tullamore town, and the first Earl to do any serious town planning was the Charles Moore, the first Earl of Charleville, seen here in his robes there as a Grand Master of the Masonic Lodge of Ireland in the 1740s. He has a substantial tomb by Van Nost, which is shown here on the right, and tells the story of his family. He died childless in 1764, and his property passed to his nephew, who unfortunately died in the same year, and he's commemorated in that George III-like bust at the sitting on the urn. And following on from that, then, a child of 5 or 6 weeks old inherited the town of Tullamore and about 20,000 acres in 1764. And it was that young man, when he came of age, who set about planning the town that we know today and promoting the development of it. Now, what is the town that we know today? Well, we can see it here taken from the railway, or above the railway line on the southern side of the town, looking towards the Saul's Tullamore Yarns property, where that extensive roof is, and which is the site of the old jail, and moving on down to the Mhór Street, which is beyond the Court Hotel, which is shown there on the right. And further out then is the Grand Canal and the town centre, including the bridge centre. And Mhór Street, as we know it today, as we look towards the eastern side of it from Acres Hall, which is on the western side. And on the southern side of the square are the Acres Pierce properties, about 9 of them, and beyond that is Victoria Terrace. And on the northern side, where the cars, where that car is parked on the left-hand side, where Terrell's shop is, they are those houses are built on the garden of number 29 High Street. This is the street, another view of the street here, looking towards Acres Hall. Acres Hall was built in 1786, and to the right of it is the Presbyterian Church. You won't see it there in any great detail, but there are 2 water pumps, one in the centre of the street, and a new one to the left where that boy is standing in the second photograph. That was the beginning of the town water supply, a proper supply by piped water in 1895. Now the other end of the street then at Mhór Street is approached from what will be called the Christian Brothers Field, and is now the site of Killeigh, while Fergal McCabe has provided the illustration on the right hand there, which again shows a couple of houses below Moore Hall, and beyond that Moore Hall itself, where the tree is there, and across the street is Victoria Terrace. Now, I mentioned number 29 High Street. That's of significance because of the extensive garden, and that's the walled area there with the 2 trees. You actually can't see 29, but you can see the house itself, but it also incorporated the house you can see with the red roof on the right. And Geashill is the next property just beyond the 2 trees, and that was also part of number 29 High Street. And beyond that again then are the railings and so on of private houses that we know today. On the left side is the old lodge house that was connected with Acres Hall, and which was demolished about 1990, and below that the Presbyterian Church, and beyond that again the town and the roundhouse building there on the left. So 29 High Street lost its boundary wall and its lawn or garden to the front when that structure was removed in the 1930s to provide a forecourt for a garage. And that building is known as the Manse on the ordnance maps because it was the home of the Presbyterian minister for many years in the 1900s to the 1930s. And you can see it's a 3-storey house with a round-headed door case to the front. And across from it you'll see the southern side of Mhór Street. So then another view of it of more recent vintage with properties for sale which have now been sold, I understand. And that Geashill restaurant that I mentioned earlier. And that Geashill with those 2 houses marks the extent to the front of 29 High Street. And as I said, the reason for incorporation of it here is the extensive garden that ran along a good deal of Mhór Street as far as a house called the Cottage and Moore Hall. And we're just taking stock of that again because you can see now the gardens that run up to 2 biggish houses in the centre of the north side of Mhór Street. The first one is the Cottage and the second one is Moore Hall. And beyond that are smaller houses and cabins. And beyond that then is the link into the garden of the house in High Street. And you can see then also a place called Bachelor's Walk. That was laid out in 1811 or so to accommodate a carriage drive by the Earls of Charleville from the castle at Charleville to the new Church of St. Catherine's at a place called Hop Hill. Now the lease I mentioned that it interconnects between High Street and Mhór Street. You can see there number 1 on the lease at the top of the map where the seal of Moore is. And that the house is marked there in 1756, and nowadays it's known as Spollan's Public House. And then it runs on a very extensive garden of probably 500 feet to a wide space marked number 2 on the map, and on then into number 3, which is the site of the Moore's second house, which is the one that was built in the 1750s and known as Moore Hall. And you see there Dr. Crofton is mentioned on the map, and that's the garden of Dr. Crofton's house, which was number 29 in High Street. The map was done by the ingenious John Mooney, who was a well-known map maker and who was from Geashill in County Offaly, and did a number of maps for Charles Moore, the first Earl of Charleville. Now this second lease map then is the map for the Windmill Hill, which is the southern side of Mhór Street and the eastern side of Cormac Street. You'll see there the Burr Road is mentioned and the road to Killeigh. And the road to Killeigh, of course, is Mhór Street today, and the Burr Road is Charleville Place or Parade, nowadays called Cormac Street. The lease there was for almost 3 statute acres of land, and that was part of the old windmill plot and was used then by Thomas Acres of Acres Hall for a development of terraces of houses. Now that's another map there it's a map of 1869, but it's in very poor condition, but it has been restored with the support of the Heritage Council. And you'll see there Charleville Avenue, that's Charleville Street later, and then it became Cormac Street, and you'll see Earl Street marked, and on closer examination you'll see the cottage mentioned as Mr. Pilkington's, and beyond that Moore Hall, which is the property that interconnected with High Street. And on the other side of the street there's the Windmill Field. That's where the Victoria Terrace was built in the late 1830s. And to the east of that is a plot which is the one that was leased to Thomas Akers, the building developer, and on which he built two terraces of houses, one fronting Mhór Street and the other fronting Cormac Street. And to the south of those terraces, you have what was known as the Wellington Barracks, which was a temporary commissariat barracks that was erected sometime between 1800 and the requirement for which would have ceased in 1815 with the end of the Napoleonic Wars. And below that again is the jail. So looking then at the at the western side of the map, you can see Thomas Akers forever and a block of a house there in the front garden. That's Akers Hall today, with a terrace running to the south of it. And then you have the present day town park. And below that again a cluster of cabins on which 10 houses were built in the 1880s, and which we'll see in a moment. So and that map is very useful in pulling together the 5 blocks of land that make up Mhór Street, and incidentally make up Cormac Street also. And as to Mhór Street, you have say 3 blocks on the southern side, one being to Thomas Akers, the near one to the house, his house. The next one is the Windmill Hill field, on which Victoria Terrace was built. And the third one to the east on the southern side is where Furlongs lived and where the Tullamore Court Hotel was built. And on the northern side then you have the big garden of number 29 and Moor Hall itself, and that was the plot upon which upwards of 25 houses, I think, were built over the period from the 1750s to the 1850s. So now let's look at it on the 5-foot scale, and you can see now 29, number 30 High Street is the dispensary, and 29 is to the south of it, and then it turns into Earl Street stroke Mhór Street, and you can see the Masonic Hall is marked and the cottage, and beyond that was Moor Hall, while on the southern side you have Victoria Terrace, and the next terrace to the left of it is the one that was built by the Thomas Akers, with that very big house with the garden to the side of it. And across the street is Akers Hall itself, built by Thomas Akers in 1786. Now these properties are shown with numbers on them to match up with Griffith's valuation, which is the printed valuation of 1854. And these maps can be viewed online in askaboutireland.com. And some more pictorial references. You remember I said about the 2 pumps, the 2 water pumps. You can see them there in the street. Akers Hall in the background. Beside it, the Lodge House. And beyond that, the Presbyterian Church. And to the very left is number 1 in Mhór Street, in the terrace of houses there. I see they're bringing in turf, and there's a cobbled channel along the street there for drainage purposes. Now that's the Masonic Hall there on the right, and then on the left of that picture you have the 2 sides of the western side of Mhór Street, the Akers Pierce development of 9 houses, and on the northern side you have a terrace of 6 houses which were built in the 1850s. And the lovely cottage then is in a cottage ornate design, and the picture here on the left was taken in the 1980s. The cottage itself dates back to 1809, and these so-called Wyatt windows may one time have been pointed like the door case when you look at the stripped back walls there in a photograph taken about the year 2000. The cottage is not now in good order, but it's an important building on Mhór Street and in the town of Tullamore. And Moor Hall I've mentioned a few times, that's it there, but it was greatly modified from its 1750s building to big improvements in the 1860s, probably in Tullamore stone, and that the detail is captured there in the drawing by Fergal McCabe, which is on the right. And a fine 2-storey house over basement with a pedimented archway on the right. And now you have two views of Victoria Terrace. They were built by a printer by the name of Willis, who had a business in O'Connor Square in Tullamore, and he built that terrace of 7 houses. Most of the houses in Mhór Street were rented, and these ones are no exception. Willis himself was paying £21 a year, or £3 per house ground rent from the 1830s, and he in turn was charging anything up to £25 per year for each house. So there was a good profit rent for him once the building was paid for. And the industrial or commercial side of the street was below Moore Hall, where initially there was about 10 cabins and a couple of smaller houses. The smaller houses still survive, but the cabins are long gone since post-famine period. And in the 1920s, Frank Hurst built a garage there, which you can see a view of here in this 1967 picture. And the new hotel was on the opposite side of the street, and you can see it there in yellow, and the road to Spollanstown. So here again now is number 1 Mhór Street, built by Thomas Akers, and he had the matching house on the Cormac Street side. And then he had a terrace there beyond number 1 of 9 houses. Some of those houses were single story, 3 of them in fact, and the rest were 2-story. Today 2 or 3 of them have been built, and they're all now rebuilt, and they're all now 2-story. Number 1 Mhór Street was one of the higher valued houses in the street, and while the cabins that I mentioned earlier, they were generally valued at no more than £1. So the garden of number 29 also served for cabins or poor quality houses between the back garden there and Tyrrell's shop, and that has now been transformed into shops in the 60s, and I think now has reverted to being a residential property. While on the other side of the street, the Acres Pierce Terrace, at least one of the houses has now an office, as shown in the picture. The lower half, then the eastern side, there were a lot more commercial units that were built on the site of the Hearst garage, while on the right hand side, one of the earlier houses on the 29 High Street garden was converted into a substantial house in the 1940s. And just to the right of that is the 6 terrace houses that were built in the 1850s. So then you have the hotel. That's a very substantial development of 1997-98. It was greatly extended in the first decade of the present century, and now has over 100 bedrooms, and is probably the most substantial commercial enterprise in Mhór Street. The old walls I mentioned of the Brothers' Field, that property goes back to the gardens of the big houses in High Street of the 1780s, and was used then for the new Cloncollig school in 2011. So that brings me to the end of the little talk on Mhór Street, and I was very drawn by the picture on the left, which shows some of the families on the street there looking at the photographer, and you can see the channels on the street for drainage and the fountain for the piped water supply dating back to the 1890s. While on the right you have a wonderful food store where freshly cooked food is served 6 days per week. So there's a lot of character and wonder in Mhór Street, and in many ways it's a very fine mixed development street between having a hotel, a swimming pool, commercial units, and quite a number of residents on the street. So thank you for your attention, and our next YouTube in this series will be on the next street, Cormac Street. Thank you very much.